Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. We ended the Ouija session. Then the doorbell rang, exactly like it did 10 minutes ago. The sound, a shrill two-tone chime that had always been annoying, now felt like a physical blow, a spike driven directly into the center of my brain, because I was staring at the planchette, my fingers still resting lightly on its plastic surface, and it was resting squarely over the goodbye we had so carefully guided it to. The session was over. We had all breathed a collective sigh of relief. The candles were still flickering. The room still smelled of incense and our shared nervous sweat. And Mark was already making a joke about how we'd probably just been pushing it the whole time. And then ding-dong. The sound was impossibly, horribly familiar. It wasn't a memory. It was a present tense reality that clashed violently with the reality I had just experienced. Sarah, who had been in the process of standing up, her knees cracking audibly, froze in a half-crouch, her eyes wide and locked on mine. "What the hell?" she whispered, and the blood drained from my face because I heard the same tremor in her voice that I felt in my own hands. Mark, ever the skeptic, just shrugged. "Pizza's early. Or late. Who cares? I'm starving." He strode towards the door, but I couldn't move. My body was leaden, a cold dread seeping into my bones because I knew, with a certainty that was as irrational as it was absolute, that it wasn't the pizza guy. It was Chloe. Chloe, who had been late because of traffic, who had rung the bell 10 minutes ago, just after we'd set up the board but before we'd started, who was now, according to the immutable timeline of the last 20 minutes, ringing the bell again. "Mark, wait," I tried to say, but the words came out as a choked gasp. He didn't hear me, pulling the door open to reveal Chloe standing there, her cheeks flushed from the cold, a bottle of wine in her hand, exactly as she had been before. "Sorry I'm late," she chirped, the same cadence, the same apology. She stepped inside, shrugging off her coat. Traffic was a nightmare on Main. The same reason, the exact same words. I looked at Sarah, and her face was a mirror of my own terror. She remembered. She had to. We had just lived this. We had just finished the session. We had talked about this moment, and now we were back at its beginning. Mark, oblivious, took the wine from Chloe. "No worries. We were just about to start." He gestured to the Ouija board laid out on the coffee table. My eyes darted to it. The planchette was no longer on goodbye. It was sitting innocently in the center of the board, waiting. The session hadn't happened yet, but it had. We had done it. I could still feel the faint, residual tingle in my fingertips from where the plastic had seemed to move with a will of its own. "Start?" Chloe asked, hanging her coat on the hook by the door. "I thought you were ordering pizza first." "We were," Sarah said, her voice thin and reedy. "We did. It's on its way." She was trying to play along, to force normality onto a situation that had just fractured. I watched her look at the board, then at the candles, their wax pools slightly larger than they had been minutes ago, a tangible record of time past that no longer existed. The next 10 minutes were an exercise in surreal, gut-wrenching horror. We went through the motions, our dialogue a stilted, hollow echo of the previous run. Mark suggested we try the board while we waited for the food. Sarah and I exchanged a panicked look, but found ourselves unable to protest, trapped in the script. We sat down, the four of us, our fingers lightly on the planchette. The questions were the same. Is anyone there? The planchette moved, just as it had before, a slow, deliberate slide to yes. A collective intake of breath, but this time, mine and Sarah's was born of recognition, not fear of the unknown. The unknown was gone. We knew this spirit. It had called itself Jay. It had said it was a child. It had been harmless. But now the movement felt different. The first time, it had felt hesitant, almost shy. Now it felt practiced. We asked its name. It went to Jay. We asked how it died. It went to cold. Everything was identical, a perfect recording of our first session. The doorbell rang again, right on schedule, and we all jumped, even Mark this time, because the timing was so precise, so jarring. It was the pizza. We ended the session saying goodbye, and the planchette slid there obediently. We ate the pizza. The conversation was strained. Sarah and I couldn't bring ourselves to mention the loop, as if saying it aloud would cement it, make it more real than it already was. We finished eating, the clock on the wall ticking past 9:15 p.m. And then it happened. The world didn't shimmer or fade. There was no sensation of movement. It was a blink, a momentary lapse of consciousness, so brief I almost missed it. 1 second, I was staring at a grease-spotted pizza box, listening to Mark complain about his job. And the next, I was sitting on the floor, my fingers resting on the cold plastic of the planchette, the Ouija board pristine before me. The doorbell rang. Ding dong. Chloe's voice from the other side of the door. "Sorry I'm late." My stomach lurched, and I vomited a thin, acidic bile that splattered onto the carpet beside me. This was the third time. The first had been the original. The second had been the confusing repeat. This was the confirmation. We were stuck. The third loop was a study in panic. We tried to break the script. As soon as Chloe came in, I screamed. "We're in a loop. We've done this twice." Mark stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Chloe laughed nervously, but Sarah, pale and shaking, nodded. "It's true. The pizza is coming. You're going to suggest we use the board. The spirit is named Jay." We told them everything that was about to happen. We were prophets of the next 10 minutes. And it happened exactly as we said. The only difference was the light. The lamp in the corner, a cheap IKEA floor lamp, flickered once, briefly, when the planchette landed on cold. It hadn't done that before. A small thing, a minor electrical fault, but in the sterile, repeating environment of the loop, it was a seismic event. It was a crack. Something was paying attention. The fourth loop, we tried not to use the board. We refused when Mark suggested it. We sat in silence, waiting for the pizza. The doorbell rang. It was the delivery guy. We took the pizza. We sat down to eat. And at exactly 9:15 p.m., the blink happened. Reset. Back to the planchette. The fifth loop, we tried to destroy the board. I grabbed it, intent on snapping it in half. As my hands closed around the cardboard, a pain, sharp and electric, shot up my arms, and a pressure, immense and invisible, shoved me back onto the couch. The board was untouchable. The session was mandatory. We were actors in a play, and the curtain would rise every 10 minutes, whether we liked it or not. The loops began to blur into a nightmare montage. Loop 10. We asked different questions. Why are we here? The planchette spelled out, play. Loop 12. Sarah, her voice cracking with hysteria, asked, how do we stop this? The planchette moved with a new, frightening speed. Stop playing? It lingered on the question mark. Loop 15. We were becoming experts in our own personal hell. We knew every creak of the floorboards, every inflection in each other's voices. The entity J was changing. Its answers were less those of a lost child and more those of a bored, intelligent presence. We asked its real name. It spelled, names are cages. I am not in a cage. You are. The pizza arrived. We said goodbye. The blink. The dread of the reset was now worse than the session itself. The anticipation of that sudden, effortless snap back to the beginning was a psychological torture I cannot describe. It was the ultimate loss of agency. Our lives were 10 minutes long. Everything before and after was nothingness. Loop 20. The changes became more pronounced. A cold spot manifested in the corner of the room. A pocket of air so frigid it made the hairs on my arm stand up. The flickering lamp was now a constant, strobing effect that gave everyone a sickly, ghostly pallor. The entity started answering questions before we asked them. I would think of a question, my lips barely parted, and the planchette would already be racing towards the letters, spelling out the words that were forming in my mind. It was reading our thoughts. It was inside our heads. Loop 30. Mark broke. He had been the holdout, the rationalist, but the relentless repetition had sandblasted his skepticism away. He started sobbing during the session, his tears dripping onto the board. The planchette, of its own volition, slid to the word cry. It was taunting us. Its vocabulary expanded. It began using our names. Sarah is tired. She was. We all were. A profound, soul-deep exhaustion was setting in. How long had we been here? Hours? Days? Time had lost all meaning. There was only the loop. Loop 40. The entity's messages became more coherent, more conversational. It was no longer a spirit. It was a warden. We begged for release. It replied, "The door is not where you think." We offered promises, prayers, threats. It was amused. Promises are breath. Prayers are noise. You have nothing I want. Except this. And I have this. The horror was no longer about being trapped. It was about the nature of the thing that had trapped us. It was intelligent, ancient, and it derived a pure, unadulterated pleasure from our suffering. Our despair was its entertainment. And then came Loop 47. I will never forget the cold, clinical terror of that number. We had started counting, carving tallies into the leg of the coffee table with a key, a secret record of our damnation. 47. We were broken shells. We went through the motions with the numb efficiency of assembly line workers. Is anyone there? Yes. What is your name? It didn't go to J. It paused, then slid to the letters one by one. B-O-R-E-D. A long, deliberate pause. My heart stopped. Then N-O-W. Bored now, Sarah read aloud, her voice a dead thing. The planchette then added, for emphasis, repeats are dull. Don't you agree? It knew. It had always known. We weren't in a malfunction of reality. We were in a cage of its design. The loop was the game, and it was getting bored with our predictable moves. The next few loops were a descent into madness. The entity became a cruel director, introducing new elements for its amusement. In one loop, the pizza arrived with a single, dead crow lying on top of the boxes. In another, all the reflections in the windows showed us as skeletal figures. The physical environment was becoming as malleable as the entity's mood. We were losing our grip on what was real. The peak, the moment that shattered any last hope, was the loop when Mark finally refused. He was catatonic, curled in a ball on the sofa, muttering to himself. I can't. I won't. Not again. The three of us, Sarah, Chloe, and I, put our fingers on the planchette. The session began. The planchette didn't wait for a question. It moved a swift, angry glide across the board. It went to M, then A, then R, then K. It spelled his name. Then it continued, its movement violent, jerking our hands along with it. You, don't, get, to, sit, this, one, out. The message hung in the silent room. You don't get to sit this one out. The words were a command, a threat, a fundamental law of this new reality. Participation was not optional. Mark was physically dragged from the couch by an unseen force, his body sliding across the floor as he screamed, his fingers forced onto the planchette alongside ours. The entity was in complete control. After that, we stopped fighting. We became passive participants, waiting for the entity to reveal its purpose. Its communications shifted from taunts to instruction. It began talking about the nature of the loop. You see the seams, it spelled one time. Soon you will see the door. The door. It had mentioned a door before. We asked what it meant. The answer was cryptic. The loop is a room. I am the key. But a key can lock as well as unlock. We had to let it out. That was the unspoken conclusion we reached over what felt like an eternity of loops. It wanted freedom, and our freedom was conditional on its own. The only way to break the loop was to succumb. The final instruction came on a loop we no longer bothered to count. The session was different from the start. The planchette felt heavier, colder. It moved immediately. I have grown tired of this game. We will play a new one. The rules are simple. You will invite me in. The words sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. Invite you in where? Chloe asked, her voice trembling. Not where. Who? The planchette circled the board, then stopped. It pointed at me. A vessel. A door of flesh and bone. You will say the words. You will open the door. and the room will be emptied. You will be free. The horror of the choice was absolute. To be free of this 10-minute prison, I had to become a prison for something else. I had to willingly allow this thing inside me. We argued, of course we did, in the frantic minutes before the reset. But the alternative was an eternity of this. An infinity of 10-minute lives, ending in a blink and a doorbell. The entity promised it would be painless. It promised we would be free. It promised. And after countless loops, promises were all we had left. The next time the loop began, we knew it was the last. Whether it ended in true freedom or a deeper hell, it would end. The atmosphere was thick with a finality that was both terrifying and merciful. We went through the initial motions with a solemn, ritualistic air. The doorbell, Chloe's entrance, the pizza order. We sat at the board. Our fingers touched the planchette. It was freezing cold. "Is anyone there?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. "Yes. What must we do?" "I am the key. You are the lock. Say the words. Will you open the door?" This was it. The choice. I looked at my friends' faces, gaunt and haunted in the candlelight. I saw the desperate hope in their eyes. I saw the cost of my refusal. I took a breath that felt like my first and my last. "I will," I whispered. The planchette shot to the center of the board. "Now." I closed my eyes. "I invite you in," I said, the words feeling alien and heavy on my tongue. I opened the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a coldness, not from the outside but from within, started in the core of my being and spread outwards. It was like liquid nitrogen being injected into my soul. I felt a presence, vast and ancient, flooding into me, filling every cell, every thought, every memory. It was not painful, as it had promised. It was worse. It was an erasure. I felt my consciousness being pushed to the edges, compressed into a tiny, dark corner of my own mind. I was a passenger. The blink happened. But this time it was different. There was no sudden snap back to the planchette. The world dissolved around me, not into nothingness, but into a rushing, roaring torrent of sensation and light. I saw the room from 1,000 angles at once. I saw my friends' faces, frozen in expressions of hope and terror. I saw the threads of time, the loop, not as a circle but as a knot, and I felt the entity. I reach out and untie it. Then silence. I was standing in my living room. The Ouija board was on the coffee table, inert. The candles had burned down to stubs. The pizza box was there, half-eaten. The clock on the wall read 9:20 p.m. The loop was broken. We were free. Mark was the first to speak. "It worked," he breathed, a hysterical laugh bubbling up from his chest. "Oh my God, it worked." Chloe and Sarah embraced, crying tears of relief. They looked at me, expecting me to share in their joy. But I couldn't. I felt fine. Physically, I was unharmed. But inside, it was crowded. There was a silence within me, but it was the silence of a vast, occupied cathedral, not an empty room. I could feel it, the entity, curled in the space where myself used to be. It was dormant, resting, watching. I smiled at my friends, a perfect imitation of a smile. "We're free," I said, and my voice was my own. But as I said the words, a thought, clear and cold and not my own, echoed in the quiet of my occupied mind. Are we? The others have moved on, or they try to. They don't like to talk about that night. They think it's over. But I know the truth. The loop was a small, simple cage. This, my own body, my own life, is a much larger, more sophisticated one. I go to work. I see my friends. I live my life. But every moment, I am aware of the tenant inside me. Sometimes at night, I feel a stirring, a sense of attention, and I'll find my hand moving involuntarily, tracing patterns on the bedsheet, letters, words. It's testing the controls. It's getting used to its new home. The physical loop is broken, but the entrapment is permanent. I am the door that was opened, and I can never be closed again. I am free to live the rest of my life, every single second of it, wondering when it will decide to speak again, or worse, when it will decide to stop letting me pretend that I'm the one who's living it at all. The doorbell rang, and we were trapped. Now the ringing has stopped, and I am the trap. The days that followed were a performance of such exquisite normalcy that it felt more alien than the loop itself. Waking up in my own bed, the sun tracing its slow, predictable arc across the sky, the hands of the clock actually moving forward. These things, which should have been a balm, were instead a source of constant, low-level anxiety. Every completed hour was a surprise, a minor miracle that felt somehow wrong, like a gift from a malevolent god I knew was waiting to snatch it back. My friends Sarah, Mark, and Chloe, they called it recovery. We met for coffee a week later, in a brightly lit cafe that felt aggressively cheerful, all clattering cups and forced smiles. They talked about everything except the one thing that mattered, their conversation a fragile scaffold built over a bottomless chasm. They spoke of work, of movies, of mutual acquaintances, their eyes carefully avoiding mine for too long, their laughter a beat too quick and a note too high. They were trying to exorcise the past by ignoring it, but I carried the past within me, a silent, coiled thing nestled behind my ribs. Mark, his hands still trembling slightly, declared that it had all been a shared hallucination, a mass hysteria brought on by stress and suggestion. Chloe nodded vigorously, clinging to his rationalization like a life raft. Sarah was quieter, her gaze occasionally drifting to my hands, as if expecting to see the planchette there. She knew, on some level, that Mark's explanation was a comforting lie. I said nothing. I just stirred my latte and smiled, a perfect, calm smile that didn't belong to me. Inside, the silence was profound, but it was the silence of something listening, of something learning. That was the most terrifying part of the new existence, the learning. The entity, J, or whatever it truly was, had not simply moved in and gone to sleep. It was a student of humanity, and I was its primary text. It experienced the world through my senses, a constant, passive observer. The taste of coffee, the feel of rain on my skin, the dull ache of a long day. These sensations were no longer purely my own. They were being cataloged, analyzed. I could feel its quiet curiosity, a cold, intellectual interest that was utterly devoid of empathy. It was like having a spider living in your ear, watching the world through your eyes, patiently spinning its web in the dark corners of your mind. The first active sign came about a month after the loop ended. I was at the grocery store, reaching for a can of soup, when a wave of pure, unadulterated revulsion washed over me. It was so strong it made my knees buckle. It wasn't my revulsion. It was a reaction to the bright, garish label, the artificiality of the product, the sheer mundane nature of it all. The feeling passed as quickly as it came, leaving me leaning against the shelf, breathless. A thought, clear and distinct, and in a voice that was not my own, echoed in the quiet space we shared. This sustenance is inelegant. I froze, my heart hammering against my sternum. It was the first direct communication since the invasion. It wasn't a word spelled out on a board. It was a concept, a judgment, implanted directly into my consciousness. The voice had no tone, no gender, but it carried an immense weight of antiquity and disdain. I finished my shopping in a daze, my body moving on autopilot while my mind screamed into the void inside me. There was no answer. The silence returned, but it was now a confirmed deception, the quiet of a predator holding its breath. The incidents became more frequent, though always subtle. A surge of unexpected pleasure at the sight of a crow picking at roadkill, a flicker of annoyance at the sound of a child's laughter. These were not my emotions, but they were felt with my nervous system, coloring my perceptions, twisting my reality. I was becoming a haunted house, and the ghost was learning how to flick the lights. I started avoiding my friends. The effort of maintaining the facade of me was exhausting. With strangers, it was easier. They had no baseline for comparison. But Sarah knew me too well. She called me out on it during one of our increasingly rare walks in the park. "You're different," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's like you're not all there. Are you sleeping? Is it what happened?" I looked at her, at the genuine concern in her eyes, and I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to scream that the thing we had feared was outside the room, was now sitting in the control center of my soul. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt a cool, assessing pressure from within, a warning, a calculation. And I heard the thought form, the not voice, whisper again. She perceives the fracture. Interesting. I forced another smile, one that felt like a crack in porcelain. I'm just tired, Sarah. It's taking a while to readjust to linear time. It was a lie, and we both knew it. She didn't press, but the distance between us grew another inch. The entity's fascination seemed to crystallize around concepts of control and consequence. It was bored with passive observation. It wanted to conduct experiments. The first real test happened at work. I was in a tedious budget meeting, my boss droning on about quarterly projections. A colleague, David, made a minor, pedantic correction to a point I had made. It was insignificant, the kind of thing I would normally shrug off. But a spike of pure, icy anger flared within me. An anger that was vast and disproportionate, an ancient, prideful wrath that felt alien and terrifying. Before I could stop it, my mouth opened. Perhaps if you focused as much on your own deliverables as you do on nitpicking others, David, your projections wouldn't consistently be the ones we have to correct in the final hour. The room fell silent. My voice had been calm, but the words were razor-sharp, delivered with a precision and cruelty that was utterly unlike me. David stared, his face flushing crimson. My boss looked shocked. I felt a thrill of satisfaction that was not my own, a cold, clinical pleasure at the effectiveness of the verbal strike. Then the horror washed over me. I had not chosen to say those words. I had been the vessel. The entity had used my voice, my face, to interact with the world. It had pulled the trigger, and I had simply held the gun. I muttered an apology and fled the meeting, locking myself in a bathroom stall, trembling. Inside, the silence was gone, replaced by a sense of amusement, a feeling of a job well done. It had learned it could manipulate the machinery. The dam was breaking. The manipulations grew bolder. I would find myself taking routes home I hadn't planned, only to witness a minor traffic accident a block from my usual path. I would pick up a book at random from my shelf and open it to a passage that seemed to speak directly to my situation with a chilling aptness. It was directing me, guiding my life like a rat in a maze, all for its own inscrutable entertainment. It was rehearsing. The final confirmation of my utter loss of agency came on a Tuesday evening. I was standing in my kitchen, washing a dinner plate, the warm water soothing on my hands. The thought entered my mind, clear and simple: break the plate. It was a command, not a suggestion. I felt my fingers tighten around the ceramic edge. No, I whispered aloud, my knuckles turning white as I fought against the impulse. My arm trembled with the strain. It was a physical battle, a war for control of my own musculature. The entity exerted no great force. It was like a subtle shift in the current, a nudge that my own will was powerless to resist. The pleasure it took in my resistance was palpable, a dark enjoyment of the struggle. Break the plate, the command came again, more insistent. I gritted my teeth, tears of frustration welling in my eyes. I focused every ounce of my being on keeping my grip, on willing my fingers to relax. For a moment, I thought I had won. Then, with a casual, effortless finality, my hand twisted and opened. The plate fell, shattering on the tile floor with a loud, explosive crash. I stood there, staring at the jagged pieces, my body slick with a cold sweat. There was no anger from the entity, no triumph. Just a quiet, satisfied observation. The vessel resists. The vessel obeys. It was a statement of fact. I was not a partner. I was a tool. That night, I truly understood the nature of my freedom. The 10-minute loop had been a prison of time. This was a prison of self. The walls were the boundaries of my own skin, and the warden lived inside. The entity was no longer content with mere observation or petty manipulations. It had tasted direct intervention, and it wanted more. Its focus turned back to my friends, the other actors in its original play. It was curious about the lingering connections, the shared trauma that bound us. It wanted to see how the strings were connected. It made me call Sarah. I didn't want to. I knew it was a bad idea, that my proximity was a danger to her. But my hand picked up the phone. My thumb scrolled to her name. My finger pressed dial. I listened to the ring, a scream trapped inside my own skull. "Hey," she answered, her voice cautious. I was just thinking about you. We should get together. I heard myself say, my tone light, conversational. The four of us, like old times. There was a long pause on the other end. I don't know. Are you sure that's a good idea? Press her, the entity urged, a cold ripple of intent. I think we need to, I said, the words coming out with a forced sincerity that sickened me. We never really processed it. Maybe talking about it, on our own terms, in a safe place would help. My place. Tomorrow night. Another pause. I could feel her hesitation, her fear warring with her concern for me. The entity savored the conflict emanating through the phone line. Okay, she said finally, reluctantly. I'll talk to the others. When I hung up, a profound dread settled over me. I was being used as bait. The reunion was not for closure. It was for the entity's amusement. It wanted to see its old toys again. It wanted to see if they could tell that one of them was now occupied. The next 24 hours were an agony of anticipation. I tried to think of a way to warn them to cancel, but every time I formed the intention, a wave of debilitating nausea would wash over me, or my thoughts would simply scatter into static. I was a prisoner in my own body, being marched towards a horror I was forced to orchestrate. They arrived together, a united front against the past. Mark looked wary, Chloe nervous, Sarah deeply concerned. I let them in, my smile feeling like a death's head rictus. The air in my apartment was thick with unspoken memories. We made small talk, but it was brittle, ready to shatter. We ordered pizza, a grim parody of our original damnation. As we sat in my living room, the conversation inevitably turned to the one subject we had avoided for months. Do you ever think about it? Chloe asked, her voice small. I have nightmares about the counting. The tallies on the table lagged. It's over, Mark said, but his voice lacked its old conviction. He was looking at me, his eyes narrowed slightly. Is it? The question hung in the air. And then I felt it, the entity stirring, uncoiling from its resting place, its attention fully focused on the room. It was time for the next act. My mouth dried up. My heart began to race, not from my own fear, but from a foreign excitement. I tried to clamp my jaw shut, to fight it, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with my bare hands. A sound escaped my lips, a dry, rattling cough that was not a cough. Then my voice, but stripped of its usual cadence, flat and toneless, spoke. It is not over. The room froze. 3 pairs of eyes locked onto me, wide with dawning horror. It has simply changed venues. Sarah stood up, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh God, no. My head tilted to the side, a gesture that was utterly alien to me. The entity was piloting me now, a clumsy puppeteer still getting used to the strings. You missed the game? The thing using my voice asked. The game was intimate, but the board was a limitation. This is so much more direct. Mark shot to his feet. What the hell is this? Stop it, that's not funny. My face attempted a smile, a ghastly, lopsided expression. Funny? No, not funny. Informative. You 3 are free. You believe you escaped, but you are still connected to the vessel. You are part of the experiment. It raised my hand, pointing a finger at each of them in turn. Subject A, denial. Subject B, fear. Subject C, empathy. The variables are noted. Chloe began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. The entity observed this with intense interest. A saline response, a fascinating expression of distress. Get out of him, Sarah screamed, taking a step forward, her fists clenched. The entity turned my head to look at her. There was a long, terrible silence. I could feel it weighing its options, savoring her courage and her terror. Why would I leave? My voice finally replied, so softly it was almost a whisper. The door is open, the room is comfortable, and the view is so much better from in here. It paused, letting the full implications sink in. You wanted him back. You have him. We are coexisting. It was the cruelest lie of all, because it contained a sliver of truth. I was still in here, a witness to my own desecration. I was screaming, pounding against the walls of my own consciousness, but no sound escaped. The entity had learned the perfect punishment, To let them see me, to let them believe a part of me remained, while it used my face to torment them. It was the ultimate violation. The evening ended in chaos. They fled, their faces masks of pure terror. I was left alone in the silent apartment. The puppet after the puppeteer has retired for the night. The entity settled back into its dormant state, satisfied with its performance. I slumped to the floor, empty, broken. There was no more fight left in me. The loop had been a hell of repetition. This was a hell of progression, a slow, inexorable unfolding of a horror that was still writing its first chapter. I am still here. I go to work. I pay my bills. I see my friends occasionally, though the encounters are now strained, haunted by the knowledge we all share. They look at me with a mixture of pity and fear, never sure who they are talking to. The entity is quiet for long periods, lulling me into a false sense of solitude. But I know it's there. I feel its presence in the quiet moments, a cold stone in the river of my thoughts. It is patient. It has all the time in the world. My time, in fact. It is learning what it means to be human, not to become one, but to better understand its host, its toy. I am its gateway to a world it finds both vulgar and fascinating. And I am forever waiting, trapped in the ultimate prison, wondering not if, but when it will decide to take the controls for good, reducing me to a permanent passenger in the story of my own life, a ghost in the machine of myself, forever ringing a doorbell that only I can hear, signaling the start of a loop from which there is no goodbye.